Hello, and welcome to the 11th reading of Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. In it, Bod is now, I think, about 8 years old. He's still living in the graveyard, still being looked after by Silas, his guardian, who we think is a vampire. But in the last reading, Bod had stumbled or explored the Potter's Field. That's the unholy ground on the other side of the railing where they were buried people who in the olden days would have been considered not Christian enough to be buried in a church graveyard. And there he met a young witch called Lisa Hempstock, who is sad because he never got given a gravestone. Bod likes her and has decided he's going to get her one. There were broken lumps of other people's stones and statues in the graveyard, but Bod knew that would have been entirely the wrong sort of thing to bring to the grey-eyed witch in the Potter's Field. It was going to take more than that. He decided not to tell anyone what he was planning, on the not entirely unreasonable basis they would have told him not to do it. Remember, everyone else was a bit cagey about the people buried on the other side of the fence. Over the next few days, his mind filled with plans, each more complicated and extravagant than the last. Mr. Pennyworth, his teacher, despaired. I do believe, he announced, scratching his dusty moustache, that you are getting, if anything, worse. You are not fading. You are obvious, boy. You are difficult to miss. If you came to me in company with a purple lion, a green elephant and a scarlet unicorn astride which was the King of England in his royal robes, I do believe that it is you and you alone that people would stare at, dismissing the others as minor irrelevances or small, unimportant things. Bod simply stared at him and said nothing. He was wondering whether there were special shops in the places where the living people gathered that sold only headstones, and if so, how he could go about finding one, and fading was the least of his problems. Remember, his teacher's trying to teach him how to fade like a ghost. He took advantages of Miss Burrows, his other teacher's willingness to be diverted from the subjects of grammar and composition to the subject of anything else at all, to ask her about money. How exactly it worked, how one used it to get the things one wanted. Bod had a number of coins he had found over the years. He had learned that the best place to find money was to go afterwards to where courting couples had used the grass of the gravestone as a place to cuddle and snuggle and kiss and roll about. He would often find metal coins on the ground in the place where they had been, and he thought perhaps he could finally get some use from them. How much would a headstone be? He asked Miss Burrows. Oh, in my time, she told him, they were 15 guineas. I do not know what that would be today. More, I imagine. Much, much more. Bod had £2.53. It would, he was quite certain, not be enough. It had been 4 years, almost half a lifetime, since Bod had visited the Indigo Man's tomb, but he still remembered the way. He climbed to the top of the hill until he was above the whole town, above even the top of the apple tree, above even the steeple of the ruined chapel, up where the Frobisher mausoleum stood like a rotten tooth. He slipped down into it, behind the coffin, and down, still further down to the tiny stone steps cut into the centre of the hill, and those he descended until he reached the stone chamber. It was dark in that tomb, dark as a tin mine, but Bod saw as a Dead Sea, and the room gave up its secrets to him. The Sleer, remember that's the sort of mystical creature that guards this mystical power, was coiled around the wall of the barrow. That's the underground grave. He could feel it. It was as he remembered it, an invisible thing, all smoky tendrils or tentacles, and hate and greed. This time, however, he was not afraid of it. Fear us, whispered the Sleer, for we guard things precious and never lost. I don't fear you, said Bod. Remember, I need to take something away from here. Nothing ever leaves, came the reply from the coiled thing in the darkness. The knife, the brooch, the goblet. The Sleer guards them in the darkness. We wait. Pardon me for asking, said Bod, but was this your grave? Master set us here on the plain to guard, buries our skulls beneath this stone, leaves us here knowing what we have to do. We guard the treasures until Master comes back. I expect that he's forgotten all about you, pointed out Bod. I'm sure he's been dead for himself for ages. We are the Sleer. We guard. Bod wondered just how long ago he had to go back before the deepest tomb inside the hill was on a plain, and he knew it must have been an extremely long time ago. He could feel the Sleer winding its waves of fear around him, like the tendrils of some carnivorous plant. He was beginning to feel cold and slow, as if he had been bitten in the heart by some arctic viper, and it was starting to pump its icy venom through his body. He took a step forward, so he was standing against a stone slab, and he reached down and closed his fingers around the coldness of the brooch. "Shh," whispered the spear. "We guard that for the master." "You won't mind," said Bod. He took a step backwards, walking towards the stone steps, avoiding the desiccated remains of people and animals on the floor. Desiccated, that's what happens when your body really rots down. The sleer writhed angrily, twining around the tiny chamber like ghost smoke. Then it slowed. "It comes back," said the sleer in its tangled triple voice. "Always comes back." Bod went up the stone steps inside the hill as fast as he could. At one point, he imagined that there was something coming after him, but when he broke out of the top into the Frobisher mausoleum and he could breathe the cool dawn air, nothing moved or followed. Bod sat in the open air on the top of the hill and held the brooch. He thought it was all black at first, but then the sun rose, and he could see that the stone in the centre of the black metal was a swirling red. It was the size of a robin's egg, and Bod stared into the stone, wondering if there were things moving in its heart, his eyes and soul deep in the crimson world. If Bod had been smaller, he would have wanted to put it into his mouth. The stone was held in place by a black metal clasp, by something that looked like claws, with something else crawling around it. There's something else almost snake-like, but it had too many heads. Bod wondered if this was what the sleer looked like in the daylight. He wandered down the hill, taking all the shortcuts he knew through the ivy tangle that covered the Bartleby family vault, and inside the sound of the Bartlebys grumbling and readying for sleep, and on and over and through the railings and into the potter's field. He called, "Liza, Liza," and looked round. "Good morning, young lummox," which is an old-fashioned word for a bit of a prat, a bit of an idiot, said Lisa's voice. Bod could not see her, but there was an extra shadow beneath the hawthorn tree, and as he approached it, the shadow resolved itself into something pearlescent, that means shiny like a pearl, and translucent or see-through in the early morning light. Something girl-like, something grey-eyed. "I should be decently sleeping," she said. "What kind of carrying on is this?" "Your headstone," he said. "I wanted to know what you want on it." "My name," she said. "It must have my name on it, with a big E for Elizabeth, like the old queen that died when I was born, and a big H for Hempstock. More than that I do not care for I never did master my letters." "What about dates?" asked Bod. "William the Conqueror, 1066, he sang in the whispers of the dawn wind in the hawthorn. "A big E, if you please, and a big H." She obviously doesn't know the date she was born. "Did you have a job?" asked Bod. "I mean, when you weren't being a witch." "I'd done laundry," said the dead girl, and then the morning sunlight flooded the wasteland, and Bod was alone. It was 9 a.m. when all the world is sleeping. Bod was determined to stay awake. He was, after all, on a mission. He was 8 years old, and the world beyond the graveyard held no terrors for him. Clothes. He would need clothes. His usual dress of a grey winding sheet was, he knew, quite wrong. It was good in the graveyard, the same colour as the stone and as shadows, but if he was going to dare the world beyond the graveyard walls, he would need to blend in there. There were some clothes in the crypt beneath the ruined chapel, but Bod did not want to go down to the crypt, not even in daylight. While Bod was prepared to justify himself to Master and Mistress Owens, he was not about to explain himself to Silas. The very thought of those dark eyes, angry, or worse still, disappointed, filled him with shame. There was a gardener's hut at the far end of the graveyard, a small green building that smelt like motor oil, and in which the old mower sat and rusted unused along with an assortment of ancient gardening tools. The hut had been abandoned when the last gardener had retired, before Bod was born, and the task of keeping the graveyard had been shared between the council, who sent in a man to cut the grass and clean the paths once a month from April to September, and the local volunteers in the Friends of the Graveyard. A huge padlock on the door protected the contents of the hut, but Bod had long ago discovered the loose wooden board in the back. Sometimes he would go to the gardener's hut and sit and think when he wanted to be by himself. As long as he had been going to the hut, there had been a brown working man's jacket hanging on the back of the door, forgotten or abandoned years before, along with a green-stained pair of gardening jeans. The jeans were much too big for him, but he rolled up the bottoms until his feet showed, Then he made a belt out of brown garden twine and tied it round his waist. There were boots in one corner, and he tried putting them on, but they were so big and encrusted with mud and concrete they could barely shuffle in them. And if he took a step, the boots remained on the floor of the shed. He pushed the jacket out through the space in the loose board, squeezed himself out, then put it on. If he rolled up the sleeves, he decided, it worked quite well. Had big pockets, he thrust his hands into them and felt quite the dandy. That's an old-fashionable term for someone who feels very fashionable. Bod walked down to the main gate of the graveyard and looked out through the bars. A bus rattled past in the street. There were cars there, and noise and shops. Behind him, a cool green shade, overgrown with trees and ivy. Home. His heart pounding, Bod walked out into the world. Oh, that little sign there means a big jump in time. Abanza Bolga had seen some odd types in his time. If you owned a shop like Abanazar Bolga had seen some odd types in his time. If you owned a shop like Abanazar's, you'd see them too. The shop in the warren of streets in the old town, a little bit antique shop, a little bit junk shop, a little bit pawnbrokers, and not even Abananza himself was entirely certain which bit was which, bought odd types and strange people, some of them wanting to buy, some of them needing to sell. Abananza Bolga traded over the counter, buying and selling, and he did a better trade behind the counter and in the back room, accepting objects that may not have been acquired entirely honestly, and then quietly shifting them on. His business was an iceberg. Only the dusty little shop was visible on the surface, the rest of it was underneath, and that was just how Abananza Bolga wanted it. Abananza Bolga had thick spectacles and a permanent expression of mild distaste, as if he just realised the milk in his tea had been on the turn, and he could not get the sour taste out of his mouth. The expression served him well when people tried to sell him things. Honestly, he would tell them sour-faced, it's not really worth anything at all. I'll give you what I can, though, as it has sentimental value. You were lucky to get anything like what you thought you wanted from Abananza Bolga. A business like Abananza Bolga's brought in strange people, but the boy who came in that morning was one of the strangest Abananza could remember in a lifetime of cheating strange people out of their valuables. He looked about 7 years old and dressed in his grandfather's clothes. He smelled like a shed. His hair was long and shaggy, and he seemed extremely grave. That does also mean serious. His hands were deep in the pockets of a dusty brown jacket, but even with the hands out of sight, Abananza could see that something was clutched extremely tightly, protectively, in the boy's right hand. "Excuse me," said the boy. "Aye, aye, Sonny Jim," said Abananza Bolga warily. Kids, he thought. Either they've nicked something or they're trying to sell their toys. Either way, he usually said no. Buy stolen property from a kid, and the next thing you knew, you'd an enraged adult accusing you of having given little Johnny or Matilda a tenner for their wedding ring. More trouble than they were worth, kids. "I need something for a friend of mine," said the boy, "and I thought maybe you could buy something I've got." "Well, don't buy stuff from kids," said Abananza Bolga flatly. Bud took out his hand out of his pocket, put the brooch down on the grimy countertop. Bolga glanced down at it, then he looked at it. He removed his spectacles, took an eyepiece from the countertop, and he screwed it into his eye. He turned on a little light on the counter and examined the brooch through the eyeglass. "Snakestone," he said to himself, not to the boy. Then he took the eyepiece out, replaced his glasses, and fixed the boy with a sour and suspicious look. "Where'd you get this?" Abananza Bolga asked. Bod said, "Do you want to buy it?" "You stole it. You've nicked this from a museum or somewhere, didn't you?" "No," said Bod flatly. "Are you going to buy it, or shall I go and find somebody else who will?" Abananza Bolga's sour mood changed then. Suddenly he was all affability, that means friendliness. He smiled broadly. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said. "It's just you don't see many pieces like this. Not in a shop like this. Not outside of a museum. But I would certainly like it. Tell you what, why don't we sit down over tea and biscuits? I've got a packet of chocolate chip cookies in the back room, and then decide how much something like this is worth, eh?" Bod was relieved that the man was finally being friendly. "I need enough to buy a stone," he said, "a headstone for a friend of mine. Well, she's not really my friend, just someone I know. I think she helped make my leg better, you see." Abananza Bolga, paying little attention to the boy's prattle, led him behind the counter and opened the door to the storeroom, a windowless little space every inch of which was crammed high with teetering cardboard boxes, each filled with junk. There was a safe in there, in the corner, a big old one. There was a box filled with violins, an accumulation or collection of stuffed dead animals, chairs without seats, books and prints. There was a small desk beside the door, and Abanazar Bolger pulled up the only chair and sat down, letting Bod stand. Abanazar rummaged at a drawer in which Bod could see a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and pulled out an almost finished packet of chocolate chip cookies, and offered one to the boy. He turned on the desk light, looked at the brooch again, the swirls of red and orange in the stone, and he examined the metal black band that encircled it, suppressing or squishing down a little shiver at the expression of the heads of the snake thing. This is old, he said. It's priceless, he thought. Probably not worth much, but you never know. Bod's face fell. Abanazar Bolger tried to look reassuring. I just need to know that it's not stolen, though, before I can give you a penny. Did you take it from your mum's dresser? Nick it from a museum? You can tell me. I'll not get you in any trouble. I just need to know. Bod shook his head. He munched on his cookie. And where did you get it? Bod said nothing. Abanazar Bolger did not want to put down the brooch, but he pushed it across the desk to the boy. If you can't tell me, he said, you'd better take it back. There has to be trust on both sides, after all. Nice doing business with you. Sorry it couldn't go any further. Bod looked worried, then he said, I found it in an old grave, but I can't say where. He stopped because naked greed and excitement had replaced the friendliness on Abanazar Bolger's face. And there's more like this there? Bod said, if you don't want to buy it, I'll find someone else. Thank you for the biscuit. Bolger said, you're in a hurry, eh? Mum and Dad waiting for you, I expect. The boy shook his head, then wished he had nodded. Nobody's waiting. Good. Abanazar Bolger closed his hands round the brooch. Now tell me exactly where you found this, eh? That's where we'll leave it for today.